Yeah.
Who's in the diversity club
Yes.
at Hadley Elementary, so we have some, I emailed you with some, but I was like,
Yeah.
you never told me. Okay, never told me. All those meetings you hang out with. You know, exactly. You know those 8 p.m. Zooms I do that have.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the April 19th event, April 13th event for Hadley Learns. We are here we're very, very excited about tonight's event, Suspect Citizens. We have the author of the book here who happens to live in Hadley. I will be introducing her in just a moment, and we will get started momentarily. But before we begin, I'd like to announce that we have a May event that is just being announced, May 9th from 7 to 8:30. And this is a really special one because the students at our very own high school, Hopkins Academy, have requested an audience with Hadley Learns and the broader community to share a project that they've been working on since pandemic times, actually. Some of their collaborators on this project have even graduated and moved on, but will participate in this Zoom-only event that I'm speaking of. And it's about the Chinese oppression of Uyghur Muslims. So I'm just going to read a little blurb that the Hopkins students have shared. Never forget, never again. The Chinese oppression of Uyghur Muslims has been declared a human rights violation by the U.S. Holocaust Museum, the United Nations, and hundreds of independent organizations. It has been called a modern-day Holocaust. Its horrors condemned in the news, but the Uyghurs are already familiar with their own persecution, and it did not cease when the media's attention did. It is our responsibility to show that the world is not forgotten and that genocide will not be allowed to happen again. The Hopkins Academy Diversity Club, has worked on its part in remembering and helping others in the community gain a deeper understanding of the systemic, cultural, and physical genocide by China. It is part of the goal. This project has been completed with the help of Pema Zidig, she's a senior, Marley Higgins, who is an alum, Sarah Wright, who's a senior, Lucy Howard, also a senior, Emerson Thorpe, a first year, Saram Chowdhury, also a first year, Ada Buthe, an alum, Gorman, Alma Gorman, a junior, Palbag Zindig, an 8th grader, Gabby Zajcek, an alum, Amy Lanham, who is the club's advisor and our esteemed faculty member at Hopkins, Aisha Sheikh, an alum, Anna Dajcek, a junior, and Rocky Buthe, a first year. Join Hopkins Diversity Club students on May 9th from 7 to 8:30 for a live online presentation and subsequent Q&A on the human rights abuses in Xinjiang. So I urge you all to attend, join us online. We will be recording it and sharing it through Hadley Media. That is the plan, at least. And we're really excited to support our Hopkins students and raise visibility for this important issue. Okay, so to tonight's program. I am so pleased to share that when Hadley Learns first got started after the murder of George Floyd, we knew that we, as a community, needed to understand the root cause of racism, and a number of us, including parents, seniors, the police chief, select board individuals, students came together in some very initial Zoom conversations that summer of 2020 to understand what this phenomenon was. And every month since then, just about every month, we've been taking in a book, a podcast, a movie, a video, and processing it and understanding racism through an array of different lenses and topics. Most recently, with the killing of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, we came together as a community to further examine the issue of traffic stops and safety. And in doing that digging, we were looking for models around the country. We were really taken with North Carolina's models of requiring consent for searches. And I thought to myself, there's got to be someone at UMass who is knowledgeable in these matters. And some digging on the website revealed that Dr. Kelsey Schaub, who's from North Carolina and is a part of a research team that examined North Carolina's policies and is very well steeped in that arena, happens to be at UMass Amherst. So it was a great moment of inquiry and finding out that actually not only are they at UMass Amherst, but they live in Hadley. So, it brings me great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Kelsey Schaub, who is, as I mentioned, an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy at UMass. Prior to that, they were an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of South Carolina, and a faculty affiliate at the Center for Effective Lawmaking. The professor researches and teaches along their interest areas of American politics, public policy, and methodology. And more specifically, they examine public policy process and race and policy issues in general using text analysis, machine learning, and big data. She is the co-author of the award-winning book, Suspect Citizens: What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tells Us About Race and Policing. 20 million, that's a lot of data points. In examining racial disparities in policing in North Carolina following a traffic stop, potential sources of those disparities, and potential policies to address them. She has also published on politics, groups, and identities, and has earned her PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She did her undergraduate work at Ohio State before becoming faculty at South Carolina. And she was a postdoctoral research associate working at the University of Virginia with the Center for Effective Lawmaking. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Schaub.
Now to wake up the computer and hope it is still connected. Slowly coming alive, slowly. Well, I just want to start off by saying thank you for having me here today. It's an honor, and I'm really excited to have this conversation. To start off, I have hopefully I have a short presentation that hits on some of the key points of the book, which after essentially the book got published, we did a series of other studies expanding on most of the key points and looking at it to the extent that we could look at it nationally. Yeah, so talking about what traffic stops can tell us about policing. So how I got interested in this area, why I started doing this work, is in fact because of the greater attention that's been brought to police and policing disparities in recent years, especially because growing up, I was both because like my family has been essentially involved in different areas with the police or policing. My dad was a Fraternal Order of Police lawyer for essentially his entire career. One of my cousins was a police officer. I was like, how is all of this happening out there in the world when people I love, who I respect, who I don't view as like racist or engaged in any of these types of things, like how is this happening with these communities that I was brought up to trust, that I do trust to a great extent. So what we've seen recently and where I started in grad school is essentially this place of there's been increased conversations, greater attention, and especially on policing disparities, nationally at least. Where most recently, as was highlighted in the intro, was the death of Tyree Nichols as a result of essentially a traffic stop by an unmarked car from some folks pulling him over and then escalating in unfortunate ways. As a result of that, many other incidents in this vein, people have tried to seek reform, sometimes successfully and sometimes not successfully. So up here, President Biden, one of his goals from his platform was to actually do some sort of like national police reform. That has not happened. So a couple months ago, we are now in April. We are fully into spring. Sorry, the shifted UMass calendar has me a little discombobulated, as I think it does a lot of the community. But in February, there was yet another piece essentially about how Biden had failed to do this. Whereas some states, some communities have actually taken some great strides in pursuing reform. You can also see, like, more generally, if we zoom out and actually go to, like, Google Trends. So this is a Google Trends figure where that's essentially Google stores all of the little things we search. And you can look over time as to what people are essentially paying attention to. So I pulled this earlier today, and so this is like people Googling police reform in the United States and specifically looking at news sources. And we see essentially in the past few years, we've really seen interest spike, which is an encouraging and exciting thing. So why are we focusing on traffic stops when most of the things that actually catch police attention are not traffic stops, or at least that is not the cause of what's catching that attention? In my research, why I focus on traffic stops, why Frank Baumgartner, who's my advisor in grad school, why he essentially started us on this path is because traffic stops are essentially every year the most common form of involuntary police contact that people have. So involuntary police contact is the type that the police initiate and we don't necessarily want to be engaged in. Voluntary police contact would be something like you called them to come to your house because it looked like someone had like broken into it or something like that. But on the police initiated or involuntary police contact, traffic stops make up, this year is 7%. This is the most recent study that's come out on this from the Department of Justice, the DOJ. And so that's why I focus on this, why a lot of other folks do. Because through routine, at least I believe, and what data kind of started to show us is that those routine interactions are the things that can tell us the most about where policy changes can be the most effective and where the biggest problems are. Yeah. So the first thing that we found in this, and that maybe isn't a surprise to folks given what's been in the news, if you read the op-eds or the book, is that racial disparities are ubiquitous, not just like within a single department, but across the country. It's not just like one department or one person's problem. It is a thing that is common across areas. So here on the screen is a figure where it's a histogram, where down here we're seeing the different search rate ratios. So essentially the rate at which white drivers are searched compared to the rate at which black drivers are searched. The larger the number, the higher the rate at which black drivers are searched compared to white drivers. Where we have the line right here is equality, would be 1. So if they're searched at the same rate, we would see people there. As you can see here, like the huge hump that's actually in that figure is over 2. So essentially black drivers on average are searched at double the rate as white drivers. Where this data is coming from is we pulled it from 132 different departments across 13 different states. Those states you can see listed down here, and you can tell that they're not all just like southern states. So one of the things that we got told or asked in response to the book, Suspect Citizens, is whether this was essentially a southern problem, whether this was born out of southern heritage, southern tradition, but no. What we find is when we did go scrounging around to see what other like state highway patrols we could get data for, what other states actually collect this kind of data. So Illinois, shortly after North Carolina passed their traffic stops law, Illinois also passed one. So since like the mid-2000s, Illinois has also been collecting and making public this kind of information. So those are the two big ones that are really rounding out this data set. Missouri has a similar type of setup where everyone has to report to the state, and they put out reports, but they don't make public the like individual data underneath it. So it's showing essentially across the country, across departments, across different types of departments, what we're seeing is by and large racial disparities, where black drivers are being subjected to a harsher form or more intense form of police contact than their white counterparts. So disparities are seen across the country. The other question that frequently gets asked then is like, but what about contraband? Because if you're doing a search, theoretically you should be like, there should be a reason that you're doing the search. You should already suspect that there is contraband in the car. That is why you're carrying that out. Even when you actually account for who's found with contraband, you still see these disparities. And there are different ways that you can account for that contraband, be it all in one, essentially estimating a model where everything is in there together. Other ways are essentially modeling it at each stage of the process. So essentially conditional on being searched, who's more likely to be found with contraband. From both of those kind of approaches, you still see the same thing, and these disparities are essentially always there. The third thing that people often ask at like this stage of a kind of presentation, is like, but what about other things? So we know that maybe traffic stops are happening, or searches following traffic stops are happening in like higher crime areas, or poorer areas, or things like that. Even when you can control for what those different aspects of the community are for those different areas of town, you again still see those disparities. And then lastly, on the less like, how to phrase this? More on the like us academics fighting amongst ourselves rather than the public asking questions. This is also on average found regardless of like what method you use or what design you actually take to study these things. So one example of a study that actually looked at this essentially using multiple different methods is this one over here by a team out of Stanford, where they essentially were like, we want to do this on the largest scale we possibly can. So they gathered information from, like they managed to get it from like every state highway patrol, and then the 100 largest police agencies across the country, and then at least one agency, at least the largest agency in every state, because not all states actually have one of the 100 largest cities in the nation. Then they go about it and essentially try and estimate disparities in multiple different ways to see if it breaks, to essentially see if those disparities go away based off of the different method, and then also asking like, do policy changes potentially shift this? Where the policy change they're looking at has already happened in the state of Massachusetts, and that's the legalization of marijuana. And seeing like pre and post that, what that does to traffic stops and traffic searches. And these other ones down here, just other studies that essentially align with these different things. So the other part then is, okay, so there are these disparities. What can we do about it? So one thing that people point to is that like at least some of this is due to individual sources. The DOJ has found when they've done investigations and when individuals have done investigations that there are like explicitly racist folks, at least on some police departments. That is a thing. And so like that is part of that like individuals, like they're definitely individual sources of some kind. The other part of that people often point to is some sort of like implicit bias. So all of us essentially internalize the information that's around us, internalize what's going on in the media, in conversations that we have. We internalize those stereotypes, we internalize all that kind of information, because when we're actually interacting with someone, we don't have time to evaluate essentially every little thing that's there, every piece of information. And so instead, what we do is rely on those heuristics that we've learned elsewhere. That implicit bias here is saying that we may have learned that certain people are more suspicious, more threatening than others. What happens then with that implicit bias in terms of how we interact, either a police officer interacting with them or like whether or not we as citizens call the police on them, is like young black men are viewed as far more suspicious as like an old white woman. And so that's where that implicit bias comes in. However, if it's an individual problem that's maybe great for police departments, but realistically not, because that is a very hard problem then for everyone to solve, not just communities. So instead, what people have argued more recently, which is really a return essentially to arguments from the 50s and 60s, is that what we see today in terms of disparities in poverty, disparities in healthcare, disparities in policing actually relate back to systemic sources, which is something that like fell on the back burner during the 70s and 80s essentially. So systemic sources then are things like policy, they're things like how institutions are structured. Systemic sources don't necessarily mean that the people currently in those positions carrying out those jobs, be they police officers or others, have any sort of malicious intent. All that means is that there are structures in place that if you don't actually confront them, you're just going to replicate what came before. One way, not everyone buys that argument, so we're going to dig a little deeper, which is again building on some of the chapters out of the book. So in the book, how we attack essentially this specific point is looking at whether there's essentially whether specific officers are actually like really good at this like search game. So whether or not some people are like really good at actually finding the people with contraband, and it's the people that are just like searching everyone and not finding anything that are really driving this. No, everyone, like when you actually plot it out, on average, like no one's particularly good at actually finding contraband in the aggregates. Like when we were writing the book, we talked to the Chapel Hill Police Department, And we like drew up, Chief Blue wanted to see like some of the reports that we were wading through to see what the data looked like. And they were looking through it and they were like, oh yeah, we actually like know who these people are. Because you can tell by like what kind of beat they're actually on. So like some people are out there just stopping as many people as they can because they're there in the speed trap in towns like Chapel Hill's, like a couple very, very nasty areas that produce a lot of crashes. And so one of those areas they dealt with one way and another is just an officer would just habitually be there to catch people essentially going like 60 in a 40 or 30 zone. Like that was like one cluster of folks. And then there were folks that were like elsewhere. So he's like, I know who these people are. And I'm like, cool. That means that there's some sort of like signal actually in this data, but maybe points to some other things that you or they should be doing. The other thing in the book that we do is then again, just look at like how ubiquitous this is, because if it's individual sources, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see it across all departments. We would expect to see it across a couple departments where those like bad apple officers actually are, and we see it everywhere. I then essentially built out this argument asking, essentially during and following the George Floyd protests, when again the rhetoric of like it's just one or two people, essentially a few bad apples on police forces are the cause. Wrote an article trying to like break that down a little bit, because if it is a few bad apples, what we would expect to see is that there aren't any systemic sources pushing that. So what I did was using that data from North Carolina and actually using data from Connecticut. So Connecticut has also been collecting traffic stop data for almost a decade now. It's what, 2023? So for almost a decade. So those two states, essentially all police departments, all sheriff's offices for North Carolina, not for Connecticut, report this information. So using that, and they also have unique officer IDs that are anonymized. So like, I don't know who those officers are and I cannot look that up, but we can tell which individual essentially is doing which stops. With that, then I could essentially identify who was a highly disparate officer. So who was actually making those stops that were disproportionately, or searching black drivers at disproportionately high rates, and could ask the question of like, theoretically, if they were never on the force, what would the disparities for that department look like? And then the second part of that, and so that would be in the world where it's all individual bias, we would expect huge changes to the agency's overall like disparity rates if those people are essentially like magicked away. On the other side of things, if it's more systemic, if it's more of that like policy driving things, what we would expect is that if we could magically change a policy back in the past, and make the data look like that, we would expect to see essentially larger returns on that kind of change. So this is going to be a figure that's just going to show those results where things above that line are greater in the hypothetical world, so like larger numbers there, larger values. Below the line is going to be greater in the observed world. One of these, this one is Connecticut, the other one is North Carolina. All the way over here, the first value for each of them is going to be that like disparity. So if it's below the line, that means the disparity is greater in the observed world, but smaller in the hypothetical world. The next ones are like essentially suspicion rates, or estimated values of suspicion. So if they're above the line in that hypothetical world, that means that someone has to be more suspicious to actually be stopped and searched in that world. So when I did this, when I like waved my magic wand in the like doing some data things way, what we see then is when we compare the results, is that on one side, that disparity value, in Connecticut, there isn't much of a substantive difference, but in both cases, you see that disparity decrease. It gets smaller in that hypothetical world where the super disparate officers have been magicked away, and where, in this case, it's a consent search ban. So like, police officers theoretically were still making probable cause searches and warrant searches and stuff like that, but we're not doing consent searches. Much smaller here for both. For North Carolina, it's much smaller. If you wave the wand and consent searches go away, not that much smaller, or the disparity doesn't decrease that much if you just remove highly disparate officers. Similarly, for like how suspicious you have to be to get searched, it goes, you have to be much more suspicious to actually be searched or subjected to a search if you ban consent searches than if you just magic away, wave the wand, and get rid of the highly disparate officers and pretend they've never been hired. So what does this mean? Is that working with individual officers is important. Like, This is not saying that there aren't individual sources to these disparities, but that a policy-based approach, a more systemic, that's essentially targeting these systemic things, is going to make a bigger impact. As well, like actually listening to the affected communities in terms of what they feel like are the problems that are going on, or where that distrust is really coming in, which is usually the end result of what's going on in negative involuntary police contact. So, example reforms that theoretically shouldn't cost money or should cost less money than other forms of reforms that people suggest. Or one is that transition from a verbal consent to a written consent for a consent search. So when you're stopped, once you're pulled over, the officer potentially can search your car. If you have like an open container out, to my knowledge, I don't think in Massachusetts you can drive with an open container like you can in some states. No, I'm getting some no's back there. So like if you had an open container in the front of your car, that would be probable cause to conduct a search. You are clearly in violation of the law. They can smell it, they can see it, like it is very evident. So that would be a probable cause. Like it's there, you have reason, you can articulate the reason, all that. On the other hand, if they don't see anything out, if there isn't any sort of like articulatable suspicion, they can still ask to search your car, or at least in some states, in some cities, they can still ask to search your car, and that's what a consent search is. If you say yes to that consent search, that's when the search can then take place. In Fayetteville and Durham, North Carolina, there was a period in which, I think it's still in place in both locations, that they switched from verbal consent, so you verbally ask, and if they say verbally yes, then that'd be okay, to a written consent form. And that written consent form is like, so here's the example. I know it's hard to see in the audience, but essentially what this is like, you write out and say like, here's my name, I'm okay with this. You actually then have to say like what you're actually saying yes to being searched, so there's no ambiguity around that. And then again, some more signatures down here. In Durham, what they specifically did was put this form out in both English and Spanish. So North Carolina, a lot of the populations throughout North Carolina are Spanish speaking. So this was, and they were the populations, part of the population that's like particularly targeted by the consent searches in some of these areas. So they wanted to make sure essentially that the two groups that were most likely to be asked for consent could actually read the form. So that was one thing that happened in both of those areas. In Fayetteville, essentially right after this happened, there's like a saga behind how it happened, but in Fayetteville, once it actually did happen, essentially consent searches largely went away, and you saw people essentially reaching out to the police at much higher rates. This entire conversation was held very, very publicly, by the way, and that's partially probably why that happened. In Durham, there was more tension between the police department and the city council, so the city council mandated that it happen. The police chief at the time did not want it to happen. It ended up resulting in him retiring and a new chief coming in. Once the new chief came in, then you saw essentially the same types of returns and the decrease in the search rates. The other way some folks have been going is just straight up eliminating consent searches. So Connecticut's law that passed in, I think it was like October 2020, sometime in fall 2020, it's a big police reform bill. One of the things that bill did, among others, was eliminate consent searches as like a thing that can happen during traffic stops. The other thing that like others have proposed and have like sometimes not actually been put into place, again to varying degrees of success, usually based off of the varying degrees of how much everyone was on the same page as to why it was being done, is limiting or eliminating equipment in other high discretion stops, so like seatbelt stops and things like that. Beyond that, there are many, many more, and if I know things about them, happy to talk about those. So, the other bit, again, to plug is that like, what might work is always going to depend on the context of what's actually happening. So what kind of police department it is, what kind of community it is, and to what degree essentially like local government, the local department, and the public are actually on the same page. Because a lot of these conversations tend to get, as we've seen in the news, largely in the news, they tend to be tense. And when people come to the table and don't trust each other, then it's hard to actually then have the conversation and do the work that would potentially make everyone's lives better in that situation. So like actually understanding each other's goals, motivations, and expectations is key to building that kind of conversation and that kind of trust. The other two things, just like flag in the background that we don't really get into in the book, is one, that the degree to which like fines and fees are a key produced by police officers. It's like a key element in all of this, especially for smaller towns. So like one study that was done a couple years ago found that essentially like especially small towns that really heavily rely on fines and fees end up like delivering like worse local services, so they like solve crimes at lower rates. This is also the thing that like the Department of Justice really hammered the Ferguson Police Department and realistically the Ferguson City Council for. It's like that is a thing in the background that like any changes to traffic stops especially would shift, because traffic stops are typically the thing that the police department has the most control over, sort of has the most control over in terms of what's going on. The other is that especially as the size of the police department goes down, as the size of the community goes down, the number of jobs that generally speaking a police department is doing is very wide. So like understanding what all those are and what might be best ways to help out or reallocate jobs is a big and messy puzzle. And the other part is like, again, when you go down to those smaller departments, each person is just, by the nature of it being a small department, everyone's doing multiple jobs. If anyone's worked at like a small business or at a small university or something like that, you know that you have to wear many hats to get anything done. And the same principle goes with police departments. So larger ones will have actual like units devoted to different types of like tasks. You can't do that when you only have like 10 people. So thanks. Sorry if I talk too long. That's like the danger of inviting a professor and giving us a podium. I look forward to the conversation, any questions. I will plug, happy to talk about like gender, sex, and policing, or how like the public responds on average to some of this.
Thank you so much. That was so enlightening. I want to acknowledge, and I should have done this at the beginning, but we're so thrilled to also have in our midst Chief Mason of the Hadley Police Department and Lieutenant Cook, also of our department. And this is really a small group, and so I'm hoping that we'll have an intimate conversation about what are Hadley's specific issues and what we've observed and what we, I'd love for us to get into some of the stuff that you talked about small communities, smaller towns relying on revenue. Is that the case for Hadley that has other revenue sources? But let's just open it up and let's start with that conversation. And I welcome other questions as well. Yes, Chief Mason.
This isn't a question, and I'm not trying to brown nose here. I was apprehensive about coming to this. I've read some of the forward in the book, and I've read some of your articles. This was phenomenal. The way that you look at the difference between, when you were really focusing on that policy-based approach, to me that was genius. And that tells me that you were looking for truth rather than trying to prove bias. If you give me your email address, you will regret it. Because I'm going to be asking you a lot of questions. We recently were on the losing end of a study that was done that was not done the same way that you approached this. And so I'm very grateful to have been invited to this. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll let somebody else
Okay,
jump in.
we want to get to all of those questions. Jane, you
I
have
was
to
going to make a suggestion that we sort of make a circle.
I was thinking the same thing. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Great, let's do that. And I think it would be okay for you to hand the room.
I'm gonna, do I need to leave this? Does this need open for you to actually? Does this need to stay open for the camera situation? Okay. I'm gonna.
Unless you wanted to be. I'll let you know when I'm not okay with it.
All right, thank you.
As I carry my many beverages over here, so
Great, and I wonder, do you want to be visible to the camera? Maybe, do you want to be on the side?
I want to be visible if you guys want me to be
Okay,
visible.
well, that makes
Let's
sense.
switch.
Come on over
Visible.
here.
We'd love to have you visible. Yeah. You're, as our guest.
Good, I'm ready.
Thank you, Joanne.
Oh,
All right, great. So did you also, thank you for this excellent suggestion. Did you also have a question?
No, I'm just
Okay.
fascinated by the research. I think that, as Mike said, it's really thorough, shall we say.
Very much so, and I love how it surfaced the structural issues, and that you came with a breadth of suggestions. I'd love to, I mean, perhaps we could get started. You have a list of questions, so let's start with the questions.
Okay, so a lot of what you focused on as far as the policy-based approach was searches. In the study that was just done, and obviously from our own experience, it's a small town. We do have a ton of traffic, like a ton. Five college area. You went to Chapel Hill, so I mean, college town, right? What is there a part of the book or a part of your work where you focus on things other than the searches in order to adjust policies to reduce those disparities? Because we don't do enough of them that I can attack it from that angle.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yes, I do know what you mean. Yeah, so the other thing in the book that we do is essentially ask the question of if you essentially, so other work has divided search or stops into essentially how to certain extent like we as drivers feel about them. So some of them we feel are like more justified, and are like very explicitly for safety purposes. So like you're driving on the road, you're speeding 20 over or something like that, you get pulled over. We may not like the fact that we are about to get a ticket, but we're like, yeah, that's on me. I knew I was doing that. That is essentially like the risk that comes with driving like that. Other points in time, it's like maybe you didn't know your tail light was out, or you didn't know that, you didn't know your tail light was out, for example, or maybe someone in the car isn't wearing their seatbelt, and it's like 50-50 on whether you're sure that someone can see that someone was not wearing their seatbelt, like in the back seat of the car or something like that. You get pulled over, you feel less good, essentially, about that kind of interaction. And your views essentially going into it, how you feel afterwards, are very different than the kind of safety stop. So the other book, I won't point that was on the side, was pulled over, and so like they essentially went into like one town and interviewed a bunch of people who had been stopped, who had these interactions with police officers, and that's where we essentially like lift that same framework of like safety versus a pretextual or investigatory stop. Really
You see the disparities.
yeah, and so like for investigatory stops or contextual stops,
Sure.
essentially how people are feeling about them, that is usually, those stops are usually much more disparate and what happens after them than safety stops. So like that's where one of those proposals that people have been kicking around is essentially stopping doing certain types of stops. And so like in Memphis, one of the things that at least one of the city council members proposed was essentially a list of different traffic violations that the department would no longer be able to pull people over for.
Right.
So like that would be one traffic-based way of doing that. And I know one of the other folks that I've been in conversations with at various points has also done some research into like what may actually help with like traffic deaths and like traffic safety and stuff like that. So if you shoot me an email, I can send you some of the stuff that they did.
Have you ever heard of Veil of Darkness?
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think about it?
And actually, can we define for the
Yes.
who the veil of darkness is?
Um,
I learned about it from that Salem State study and the
Yeah.
long
So-
thread of conversation that we had as a result.
Yeah, so what Veil of Darkness is, correct me if I'm wrong, we did a lot of research ourselves on this one. What Veil of Darkness is it's a traffic disparity theory that suggests that because in the daytime an officer would have more ability to see the gray admit that there's literally dozens, if not hundreds of other reasons that could cause this, but it's kind of the mainframe of what the theory means. And it's the only part of the last study that was done that had, any negative connotation towards Hadley. Every other part of the study, the searches, in one of your papers you talk about, I don't know, I'm not going to use the right words, but you talk about severity of outcome.
Yeah, yeah.
Everything for Hadley was lower than state averages. The stops of non-white drivers were lower than state averages, and that was one of the problems that we had with it when we were talking with the state about it, not Salem State, the actual state, EOPS, which was why are you not looking at these other factors, these other things that are involved? The veil of darkness theory is essentially built to do exactly what you didn't do, which is you looked for truth, to see what the data showed you, whereas the veil of darkness, to me, felt almost as if there was an assumption of bias there. So let's kind of go find it. And the other part of it is, what I didn't understand was that with modern day technology, police have computers in their cars, can run any license plate and get a photograph of the owner of the vehicle. So how does that not skew the data when you consider that they could do the exact same thing at night than in the daytime? So I was going to ask you about that, what your thoughts are on that one.
Can you clarify, so veil of darkness says, what did they find? Like, what was the find on veil of darkness? That
So essentially,
not for Hadley, but what is the theory?
the theory is that if you are stopping non-white drivers more in the daylight than in the darkness, then it could,
Then that's
it's a
a
disparity and
bias.
it could point to bias.
Yeah.
But they also talk about, there's also, the limitations of veil of darkness have a lot to do with the pretextual type stops, seatbelts, hands-free stuff, texting and driving, things like that. As opposed to your paper, which talks about how safety type offenses, speeding, running stop signs, running red lights, things like that, moving violations is kind of how we lump them all in, are less likely to indicate those types of things. And they also glossed over the fact that 75% of all of our stops are those types of stops. So I just had a really hard time swallowing that one. I wasn't getting a lot of straight answers from the state on how or why they approached it that way.
So there, a couple things. So one is that essentially with the veil of darkness type approach, what the strong assumptions being made is that it's essentially the same types of drivers driving the same types of ways at both of those points in time. So like one of the ways to do that is that you look at literally the same hour of day, but like right before and right after, like daylight saving. So then it's essentially like nature essentially changes what's happening, rather than anyone who's actually engaging in that. One of the reasons that people have turned like this approach to see disparities in who's being stopped is because we don't really know who's on the roads. And so essentially it's hoping that this exogenous shock, essentially nature doing the work, gives you the leverage that you need to be able to tell whether there are disparities in the groups of people that are being searched. Partially why most of my work looks at searches is because for searches we know who's stopped at least, and so we know what that denominator actually is. And so there are lots of questions about like what actually got included in the veil of darkness study and things like that. So it's like one method essentially on that one point. I think the bigger question to me that's more interesting, especially considering we're in like a small town out here in, is this town of Western Mass?
Yeah.
Yes, out here in Western Mass, is how you evaluate whether like if all of the rates at which things are happening are in the direction that you want them to happen, but you still see disparities is a big question and big problem with most of the methods to actually identify disparities. Because most of the ways we identify disparities are like dividing rates by each other. And so
twilight periods, so just for everybody to understand, what intertwilight periods are those sections of time after dawn and before dusk. And that's how they allow nature to kind of control those factors. Within those time frames, that math was literally 47 non-white drivers and 262 white drivers in those figures across the entire study. And so I was like, wow, to me, that's 5+ times more white drivers within that time frame, but the figures are so small. Like you said, when they did the math, how do you account for that? And so that was one of my issues, and there's a whole litany of other things. Jane, I've been through this round and round with Jane.
That's also what you're hitting on is why most, like, a lot of my work and a lot of other work does not look at small departments.
Yeah.
Most of that work looks at realistically like very large departments. So I think it's like 80% of all police departments, if I remember correctly, from the reading I had my undergrad students this week, are in cities that are like less than 30,000 people, but like that is not where the bulk of the research is, largely because we run into essentially these issues of like, do we trust those kind of numbers or do we not trust those kind of numbers? So like for a lot of what we do in North Carolina, especially when we're going at the age, only looking at the agency level or aggregating things up to the agency, like I would probably end up dropping out Hadley from that kind of analysis because there aren't enough stops being made. But people still want to, evaluations still need to be made, and that's where some of the conversations get very.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they dropped out some departments, but when you look at the 450-page report and all of the data that they collected, I don't know. It just to me it didn't make a lot of sense. But you mentioned Connecticut.
I have a quick follow-up on that point for one or both of you. So do we know how many drivers went through? Like you said 5 to 1, white to non-white, but if it was 10 to 1, white to non-white in terms of like the population, do we have those numbers?
So those are the two things. What she was saying is that the only thing that we can tell you is an estimate of the average, what Mass DOT calls it, is the average annual daily count. That's what they call it. And the average annual daily count of your community, this Hadley community, is about 100,000 vehicles a day. That's a lot of cars. A lot. So
I live
we
on
only
Rocky
know.
Hill, I know.
Yeah, there you go. So
We're the
we
ones
know-
that are always like, why aren't you pulling these people over?
So we know how many, we just don't know what the diversity of those drivers are. And correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ways to actually gauge who is driving through your community is something called a driving population estimate, which was apparently the gold standard before Veil of Darkness came about, and the way that they did driving population estimate, and I don't know if this is right, I don't know if it's just something that I heard, was actually to stand on the side of the road and look at people and write that and click it.
That's what I thought was true.
Right. But that we don't know. We don't know that there's been 2 studies. Yeah.
I've got a clicker.
So there's been 2 studies done in Massachusetts since I've been a police officer. One was in 2004-ish, and one was in 2020. And they'll be done annually from this point out, which is why I'm so nervous about, how do we end up with these numbers? Because we may land on this list again. We don't understand it. So in 2004 was the first time that they tried to do a driving population estimate. And when they did that study, Hadley didn't flash anything. And that was back when I was on the road, and I stopped every car that moved. Like, I was one of those folks you talked about. I was a young officer, and I loved stopping cars and speeders and stuff like that. So, to answer your question, we know how many, we just don't know who.
I guess I would settle that with saying, you don't know that 5 to 1 was a good number because you don't know how, right? We don't know the proportion of people. It could be 200, it could be 10 times as many, so that's just something to keep in mind because we don't have the data.
The only data they use is the population of Hadley.
Which is obviously really
It's
irrelevant.
on the road.
Yeah.
That's not, it's on the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in the policy part of this. Because, even though what we focused on tonight and what a lot of your research focused on is searches, if there's a way to extrapolate that to stops themselves, and there's a way to do that and still be able to keep the roadways as safe as we possibly can, I'd love to hear how to do that. I mean, one of the things that, we touched on, revenue. We don't get beat up too badly about the actual dollars. I think our issue is that, it seems like every year another law gets passed to give us another reason to stop cars. Hands-free, they're adjusting the seatbelt laws and things like that. And from what I've looked, the research that I've done, I've actually, and I may be wrong, but non-white drivers are more likely to be pulled over for those types of offenses than the non-pretextual stops that you were talking about. So we're going to keep passing these laws for us to stop more and more cars. Now, granted, town-wise, people just want cars to slow down in their neighborhoods. They don't want their kids getting run over. That's why we're out there. And we don't get, beat up about revenue. I can't think of anybody that's ever said we need to stop more cars by not making enough money.
Well, I like the idea though.
But, I just, for me, if we're gonna have any effect on that, it will have to come from us. It will have to come from the police department, because the legislators are not gonna stop continuing to pass these laws. There is revenue to be had.
Yeah, it's been one of the common policy responses to, if there's a thing happening in a car that we don't want to happen, the obvious response is that it's saying you can stop them for it. And yeah, so that's where, that's what some city councils are shifting, at least locally, in terms of saying these are the primary reason versus secondary reason. So seatbelt stops in some areas have been downgraded to a secondary reason as to why to stop a car. So it can add on essentially an additional fine, but it's not a primary reason why you can stop a car. That, but that is locally done, and that is chosen and/or is chosen by the police department, which is also locally done, but not through necessarily local government. So yeah, it is a police departments have a lot of discretion realistically in the grand scheme of things, and so it might be choosing to not necessarily enforce the primary reasons of these things that the state is having.
So this brings me to a question that I have. We talked about a number of different policy solutions. We just talked about one example right here. So how much discretion does an individual town have in coming up with a written consent policy, for instance, for searches, or deciding what infractions will not be pulled over?
So it would vary based off from state to state. So in some states things are already mandated in state law, and in other places not so much. So for example, again, our state one in Southwest Connecticut, they passed a bill a couple years ago that changed a lot of that in terms of what, for example, consent searches, they were you are not allowed to do these anymore. But they essentially got rid of them. They weren't mandating, it's not that before they were mandating that people do consent searches, it's that they were actually can't do these anymore. I don't know whether a state attorney or something would sue a city or police department if they pass something. I'm not sure if they could unless it was in direct violation of state law. I'm not sure if you guys might have more answers on that.
I was going to say, fortunately, Massachusetts is one of those states where you can't do consent searches.
Okay,
So
yeah, that's what that's not.
there's that, and seatbelt violations are
Or
secondary.
not, yeah.
So are you saying you can do searches at will?
No, I'm saying
You cannot do searches,
Yes.
period?
No, we can do searches, but we can't do simple, I can't walk up to a motorist who I've stopped for speeding and say, hey, I stopped you for doing 20 miles an hour with a speed limit, mind if I check your trunk?
So you're saying you can do probable cause?
I can do probable cause search, correct.
So if that driver had an open can of beer
Yes.
in that seat, then they
especially if you're driving a car,
Yeah.
chances are you will violate some, like some
Start
rule
your
of the
headlights or
road
facing the wrong
in,
way,
like,
or,
you
yeah.
know, in 10 minutes.
And they just passed the bicycle safety law in Massachusetts where you have to give bicyclists, a certain width around them. You can't buzz a bicyclist.
Well, then we'll have more things to complain about on Rocky Hill, because people are not giving us our.
As the bicycle bill, and then hands-free bill. And then a few years ago, they passed the slow down, move over. You've got to slow down, move over for emergency vehicles that are parked on the side of the road. So,
And if you look at it, and most of these have really high fines. I mean, window tint, what's window tint? $250 per window. Per window, that's over tinted, like they just, I mean, it's just, they passed the laws. It's not for any type, I mean, granted, okay, so if your windows are too dark and you can't see through them, I suppose that's a safety issue, but, you know, it's just, to me, open container, open container is $500. Right, it's like,
Okay,
next to my
that one's
driver
the
is